Hello and welcome back. We hope you had a good break, and we are looking forward to now diving into our third session, addressing our third question: how can hospitals defend their prices? What we recognize is, with all of this information now being more public than ever, this question has frequently come up as to how hospitals are able to address pricing transparency, address the variances that might be present in their data, and to be able to defend their position. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Scott Houk and Courtney Vance, who are going to be facilitating this conversation today.
Hi, I'm Scott Houk, Director of Consulting Services here at Cleverley & Associates. As Jamie mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit over this next session about how hospitals can defend their pricing position. I'm going to be joined today by my colleague, Courtney Vance. She will be talking through some of the points here today. So as Jamie kind of mentioned in the overview, this is something that folks are talking about now. I'm going to go ahead and move up a couple of slides. Why should you defend your position? There are a number of things going on in the current environment. This data is being reviewed by the public, payers, by the government. So you need to be ready for questions and challenges that may arise. Your board and your finance committee may need some education and talking points so that they can actively address the questions that they are getting. We also find it useful for setting internal policy, creating some guiding principles for maintaining defensibility. Also, as you go through the process of reviewing your defensibility, it helps you to explain why there may be some differences that do exist when you're compared to your peers. And last but not least, can help you prepare for some potential contract negotiations with payers. As we're certain that those things will be an outcome of price transparency sooner or later. So one of the things we're going to talk about first is what are the key reasons that there may be differences between payment and charge. And there are three main factors that we talk about when a hospital looks at defending their pricing and payment position. First of all, it's cost. You've got to cover the cost of the care that you're providing. Secondly, you need some profit. Every facility needs to be able to pay off debt, reinvest back in their facilities, so you require some profit above and beyond covering your cost. And then your payer mix and payer terms are also going to have an impact on how you price and where your payments are set. An example that we give on here is hospitals that tend to have a higher level of Medicaid and indigent care population tend to have higher prices because they've got to make up for some of those losses through some of their commercial payers. Next, we'll go into what are the primary methods for defensibility. Here we have essentially two methods that we look at for defending pricing and payment position. One is an ROI model, simply looking at your return on investment. This is an approach similar to how public utilities set their rates. Secondly, is looking at things from the peer position standpoint. How do your prices look at a facility level, at a case level, departmental level, down to CPT code level, what compared to your peers, not only from a charge perspective, but also from a net payment perspective. We believe as we go through this, we're kind of going to break this up into three different reviews. One is looking at things overall from an ROI approach, which we believe is a method that hospitals can use to look at both gross and net payment position. And then we're going to look at the peer position, kind of broken up between both gross and net. So using some different metrics for each one of those sections. When we talk about ROI, as I mentioned briefly before, this is essentially the public utility approach. How do hospitals go about setting their rates similar to how a public utility might? And you'll see a box on the screen with the ROI formula that says that ROI is equal to volume times price, which is your charges / payment, less volume times cost, which is your expenses, divided by your investment. What we're seeking to do here is to isolate the price variable by testing the other three. So we can look and see if your ROI is excessive, is your cost excessive, is your investment in your facility excessive. And if we're able to say no to all three of those, then by definition, your gross price and your net payment are not excessive. The second method, which really kind of broken into two parts, looking at things from a gross perspective and a net perspective, is your peer position. And we're going to look at some metrics you'll see highlighted on the screen here. Overall hospital charge index, from a gross price perspective, this is a proprietary metric that we use here at Cleverley & Associates to look at your overall facility level charge. And then we'll look at some inpatient case charges by looking at your top charges by MSDRG. And on the outpatient side, we'll look at your charges by APC. Turning over to net, we will then look at a metric called net patient revenue per equivalent discharge. An equivalent discharge is a metric that you may not be familiar with, so we do have a couple of slides to talk through that. And then similar to the in and outpatient case from a charge perspective, we're going to look at your net payment by MSDRG and by APC using some proprietary data that we have here at Cleverley to be able to look and benchmark those against some regional and national peers. To walk through this, we're actually going to walk through a case study. So we have our fictitious sample hospital called Maverick Hospital. And first, we're going to look at that ROI approach and what are the metrics that you might want to look at in doing so. So from an overall ROI perspective, we're looking at the metric EBITDA to assets. EBITDA is your earnings before interest, depreciation, amortization divided by total assets, which you can see on the slide here for our sample hospital Maverick. They are at 4.89%. Their peer median is at 10.8, almost 11%. The state median, another benchmark to compare against, is about a little less than 9%, and the US median is just below 10%. So this is a metric, for all of you financial folks out there, this is a metric that you really want to be higher, but from a defensibility standpoint, lower is actually a more defensible position, or being closer to the peer and the market medians. So in this case, no one could look at Maverick Hospital and say, gosh, it looks like they're making too much money. So this helps point us in the direction that it would appear that their overall ROI is not excessive. Prices and payments may not be excessive. But again, we're going to look at that in conjunction with cost and with investment. So the next metric we turn to is to look at your overall hospital cost index. This is a proprietary metric developed by Cleverley & Associates that looks at your overall cost position at a facility level by first identifying an inpatient cost index and an outpatient cost index. On the inpatient side, we're looking at your average Medicare cost per discharge, case mix and wage adjusted. On the outpatient side, we're looking at your Medicare cost per visit, relative weight and wage index adjusted. And we're comparing both of those against a US median value. Once we have an inpatient index and an outpatient index, we actually weight those two based on your in and outpatient revenue mix to get the overall cost index. So for Maverick Hospital, what we see in orange is the overall blended hospital cost index, red is the inpatient, and green is the outpatient. Maverick Hospital happens to be a very low cost facility. US median is right around 100. With this index, lower than 100 would mean a lower cost position, higher than 100 would mean a higher cost position. So they're overall at 85. They're below the average of their peers, below the average of the state and the US median. And we see the same thing holds true when we look at both the inpatient and the outpatient cost index. So it would appear overall that cost appears to be reasonable at Maverick Hospital. So they're not making too much money. Their cost position is actually fairly low relative to their peers. So our third test under the ROI approach is to look at investment. So we're going to look to see, is investment excessive? By looking at these two metrics, revenue to net fixed assets, also known as your FAT ratio. So how many times are you turning over that net fixed asset base with your revenue? And we couple that with the accumulated depreciation percentage to get an idea as to how old is your plant. We kind of expect that the older the plant, the more accumulated depreciation you have, the higher that FAT ratio should be. So Maverick appears to be in a position of having a higher FAT ratio than their peers, also a little bit older plant. So their metric would certainly show that they're getting a good turn on their net fixed assets, especially relative to their peers. So again, it doesn't appear that their investment in plant is excessive. They benchmark very well both against their peer median, state median, and the US median. So from there, we can draw the conclusion that from an ROI perspective, we meet the three tests. We're not excessive in overall ROI, we're not excessive in cost, and we're not excessive in the amount of investment we have put into our facility. So the overall ROI approach appears to be a method that can be used to defend overall pricing and payment position for Maverick Hospital. At this point, we're going to switch gears and start looking at things from a gross price perspective and look at peer benchmarks. And to do so, I'm going to turn the floor over to my associate, Courtney Vance.
Hi, I'm Courtney Vance. I am on our consulting team. and I am going to be walking us through our peer positioning of gross prices, continuing on with the case study that Scott started from Maverick Hospital. So I'll start with facility level, but we will go through both outpatient, inpatient, as well as CPT to measure gross charges in. This slide should look familiar to you from Scott's portion because it is the hospital charge index, similar to the hospital cost index. It's calculated the same way, but we replace charge for cost. It is an objective comparison across facilities, and like the cost index, it normalizes for resource intensity, wage index, as well as the mix between inpatient and outpatient. And similar to the cost index, a higher score here indicates a higher relative charge position. So continuing with our case study, we see Maverick Hospital here charted against the peers, state and US median for the overall charge index in orange, the inpatient charge index in red, and the outpatient charge index in green. And starting with our overall in orange, you can see they actually index from a gross charge perspective at a higher amount at 121 than their peers, which are at 108, so about 10% higher. Lower than the state median at 134 and higher than the US. So a mix against all of those other measures, but most importantly, they are measuring higher against their peers. Interestingly, when you move into inpatient, they actually measure about 10% lower, but that is being offset by the outpatient charge index, which is almost 33% higher than their peers. So in general, we see that gross charges at Maverick Hospital appear to be higher, but there is a mix between inpatient and outpatient there. We do like to look at this metric, which is Medicaid charges as a percentage of total, because it may indicate why charges could be higher. We typically see hospitals that have a higher percentage of Medicaid in their charges do often pass along higher charges to sort of offset and subsidize the Medicaid business. We are not seeing that here because Maverick Hospital's Medicaid charges are actually lower than their peers, their state, and the US. So this is not the reason for their prices being relatively higher. So now we're going to move into our outpatient gross charge measure. And on this one, we have our top 10 charge APCs for Maverick Hospital. Here at Cleverley, we assign a primary APC, and we do that by designating the highest relative weight and then allowing all charges to follow that APC. And so this is a per visit view. And you'll see as you look at this chart, we have Maverick Hospital's volume and average gross charges in the middle two columns, and then our competitor average gross charge on the right. And so from an outpatient perspective, consistent with our outpatient charge index, we see that actually all 10 of these APCs are priced above their competitor average gross charge. And so that is a consistent story, and we are seeing Maverick have higher gross charges on the outpatient side. Moving to the inpatient side, a similar structure here. We're pulling the top 10 total charge MSDRGs. We have volumes and average gross charges for Maverick Hospital in the middle and competitor on the far right again. And here, as you look down the list, you'll actually see that they are priced above their peers in 7 out of 10 of these MSDRGs. So this is a little bit inconsistent with what we saw in the inpatient charge index a couple of slides ago, which showed that they were actually priced about 10% lower. One reason could be that we don't have a comprehensive list here and we're just taking the top 10. But this does show one reason why it may be important to look at more than just one measure of hospital charges to tell the whole story of price defensibility. And then our final slide in our gross charge section, we highlight the top 10 total charge CPT codes. And here we see that they are actually priced below 7 of these 10 CPT codes, priced below their peers, which is also a bit inconsistent in what we've seen in the OCI as well as the APC top 10 total charge codes. Similar to the inpatient MSDRG slide, it could be a comprehensibility issue. It could also be that they are intentionally pricing some of their CPT codes lower because these are the more shoppable codes. And then lastly, the reason for the difference between this and OCI could be because they are actually utilizing more of these codes within their APCs. So overall, we see Maverick Hospital has relatively higher prices from their peers. And now Scott is going to continue our case study and walking us through the net payment for Maverick Hospital.
Hi, thanks, Courtney. We appreciate you walking us through how hospitals might look at things from a gross charge perspective. As you mentioned, I'm going to start looking at some metrics that we can use to review a net payment position relative to peers. So there's a metric that we've developed at Cleverley Associates called equivalent discharges, and the metric we want to show from a facility perspective on net payment is called net patient revenue per equivalent discharge. But thought it might be useful to actually walk through what do we mean by equivalent discharges. A lot of you might be familiar with using adjusted discharges or adjusted patient days as a metric. So I'm just going to have a couple of slides in here to talk through those differences. So when we talk about equivalent discharges, this is actually a proprietary metric that we have developed that we think measures volume more fairly, more consistently than the equivalent or the adjusted discharge method. The way that it is different is we actually develop an inpatient equivalent discharge value by taking total gross inpatient charges divided by the hospital average Medicare charge per discharge, case mix adjusted. So since our gross charges are inpatient, our denominator is inpatient, we're getting a number of equivalent inpatient discharges. On the outpatient side, again, we're looking specifically at our outpatient volume. So we're looking at gross outpatient charges divided by a hospital average Medicare charge per visit that is relative weight adjusted. This gives us a number of equivalent outpatient visits. Then we have to convert those outpatient visits to an equivalent number of outpatient discharges. What we have chosen to use that to make that conversion is a Medicare payment conversion factor. So essentially we're looking at for those outpatient visits, the average payment per relative weight of 1, what percentage is that of a DRG at a CMI of 1? Right now, I think that index or that conversion factor is about 1.3%. So we would take that number of equivalent outpatient visits multiplied by 1.3% to get our outpatient discharges. And then we simply add equivalent inpatient discharges with equivalent outpatient discharges to get that overall equivalent discharge metric. Again, the key here is that we do have separate measures that we're using for both inpatient and outpatient. Conversely, kind of the traditional adjusted metrics that you might be used to, which is kind of the formula down at the bottom where you take your inpatient patient days multiplied by 1 plus your gross outpatient revenue divided by your gross inpatient revenue to get an overall adjusted patient days metric. The problem with that, and that we show in the box just above it, is that say you just make a 10% increase to your outpatient rates, as you kind of walk through that section there, you'll see that your adjusted patient days go from 26,000 to 27,400. And all that you have moved is your outpatient prices. So you've increased your denominator that you might use for using the same type of equivalent metric, the net patient revenue per adjusted discharge. We think would end up being a less consistent measure over time than using our net patient revenue per equivalent discharge. We also see sometimes that folks will use adjusted metrics and then apply an overall case mix index adjustment factor to it, which makes the assumption that your intensity on your outpatient services is just the same as your inpatient. That is the nice thing about the equivalent discharge metric, because it does look at outpatient intensity and inpatient intensity separately. So now that I have scrambled your brains with those two metrics, hopefully the net payment revenue slide will help to make some sense here. So this is net patient revenue per equivalent discharge. This is the facility level metric that we're going to use to evaluate overall payment position for Maverick Hospital. So what you see here is an average charge per equivalent discharge, or net patient revenue per equivalent discharge of $6,020 for Maverick. Very close, slightly higher than their peer median at $5,927, lower than the state median, and quite a bit lower actually than the US median. Now the state median and the US median values have been wage index adjusted to that of the primary hospital. So we're using some method of trying to get to a common factor here. So we've already seen that charge position was higher. Here we see our net patient revenue position from a facility perspective is actually pretty consistent with our peers. So from here, we're going to talk about what impacts hospital pricing and hopefully discover some of the reason for why we may see that inconsistency between charges and payment. So this slide simply gives just a quick case study of a hospital that has 100 patients. The cost to cover those patients is $100. So if we break those patients up between kind of major payer categories, Medicare, Medicaid, uninsured, managed care, and then other. In our example here, we're going to say Medicare doesn't quite cover cost, so they're giving about $92.50 per case on that $100 cost per case. We've got about 50% of our population that have Medicare. So we're coming up with a total payment of $4,625 compared to a cost of $5,000. So we're losing money on Medicare. And say 10% of our population is Medicaid. Medicaid pays worse than Medicare. We're getting about $75 on that $100 case, losing $250 on those. Then we have uninsured, where we're hoping that we get $5 per case on that cost of $100. So losing quite a bit, total payments of $25 there for that 5% population compared to cost at $500. And then our managed care population, and assuming here that they're paying us on fixed rates mostly, but they are paying us above cost. They're paying us $125 per case. So here we're making a profit of about $750 when you compare the $37.50 total payment to total cost. So that leaves us with 5% of our population left. So if we kind of do the math and we total things down, we've got 100 patients. Right now, through 95 of them, we've covered, we've received payment of $9,150. Our cost is $10,000. So we've got this gap, $850 just to get us back to cover cost. And then we would like to have a 5% profit margin to be able to reinvest back in our facility, pay out debt, build for the future. So at the end of the day, we're $1,350 below cost. So to make that up, off of those 5 patients, we've got to now require that they pay us on average $270 per patient, compared to, we're getting $125 at best for our managed care. Result of that, and assuming that these other payers, this is all percentage charge business, to get to that $270, say our payers pay us 90% of charges, then we've got to set our price at $300. They pay us 75% of charges, our price has to be $360 to cover that $100 cost. If they pay us 50% of charges, we've got to charge $540 to get to that $270 payment. So that impacts how we price. And the more condensed that population that you were able to get a profit on from a percent change in your charges, kind of the higher your prices are going to be. And I think that's what we see is happening here with Maverick Hospital. They had a very small population that was still paying on a percentage charge, and they're trying to get to a certain net revenue level as a result of a price change. So it really results in a higher charge position. The next few slides here, this is the loveliness of being in the age of price transparency, where we can start comparing payments. So I think most of you have probably been familiar with benchmarking charges for years and decades. Now in this new age, we can actually look at payment comparisons. So we're kind of following along the same methodology that Courtney walked you through, which we're going to look at APCs on the outpatient side. We're going to look at things by MSDRG on the inpatient side. So this slide right now is showing the top 10 total payment APCs. And this is looking at commercial payments only for Maverick Hospital. So across all their commercial plans where we've excluded Medicare, Medicaid, their average payment for a level 4 ED visit is $2,364. What we see as a benchmark, and through our proprietary database, I probably should talk about this a little bit. As we work with hospitals in setting their payment, we also setting their prices, we also analyze full payment. When we do so, we've developed a nice database that we can then benchmark other hospitals against. So all of the CNA regional averages, we have a CNA national average that you could use. When we're talking regionally, it can be broken up into the Northeast region, the South, the Midwest, and the West. For this facility, for this view, again, for today's purposes, we decided to use a regional comparison. And as we look down through there, as I started to mention on the ED visit, they're a little bit higher payment on average compared to that regional average, but they are actually lower on 9 out of the next 10. or the next 9 out of that top 10 here. So this would, again, kind of signal to us that overall net payment on the outpatient side looks reasonable. I know we saw earlier that from a charge perspective, charges were very high on the outpatient side. Turning our attention to a view that looks at things by MSDRG on the inpatient side. Here we've got Maverick Hospital's top 10, starting with the respiratory infections. Shows an average payment of $12,691 per case. The CNA regional average we see for that same case is $26,243. As you look down through here, it looks like Maverick Hospital is really has some pretty low payments on the inpatient side. They are lower on all 10 out of 10 here. Now there is the ability to benchmark at a little more definitive level. So now we can take it down to looking at a specific payer, and it's kind of a large bucket payer. We have organized our data into buckets of kind of all commercial, which covers all of those payers, and then we can break out, I think, Blue Cross, Aetna, Cigna, Humana, and United Healthcare, and do a separate individual analysis on how does Maverick Hospital's, in this case, Blue Cross average payment compared to Blue Cross for that region. So again, this may give you a little more detailed view as to how your payments benchmarked by major commercial categories. What we see here on the outpatient side is they are below on 7 out of their top 10. So a little bit different view than what we saw against the entire book of business from a commercial perspective. Turning the page to look at, again, Blue Cross from an inpatient perspective, here we see again that they are lower than their peers on all 10 of their top 10 cases. So again, with benchmarking, you can go beyond these top 10. Again, we like to, again, for the purposes of what we're able to show on the screen, just identify, you know, what are the services that you're doing most frequently, and how do those benchmark, and does that give us a pretty good idea of how you actually might compare and stack up to your peers. The one thing that you may have noticed here is we are looking at benchmarks on a regional basis is kind of the most finite that we can get to. What we have found, and what you've probably seen too, and you've heard from some of our earlier sessions, is that, you know, it is very hard to use the data that is out there in those machine readable files to get an apples to apples comparison. So we are using our own internal resources to be able to benchmark at a payment level. So we would not necessarily have the individual peer data that you may desire to have to get the best picture of your market. We're going to end with a kind of a summary slide of a review of what we have discovered as we've kind of walked through this case study from Maverick Hospital. The thing that I think is important, I know Courtney mentioned this earlier, is that while, you know, not every metric may tell the exact same story, when you look at things more globally, is everything kind of pointing in the same direction that helps you come to a conclusion on defensibility. So the observations we found from Maverick is that the ROI model certainly showed that they were not excessive in profit, in cost, or in their investment. And that would show that prices and payments are reasonable. We did see that their current prices are higher than the peer median via the hospital charge index, especially on the outpatient side, not so much on the inpatient. Also, from a facility level, we saw that their current payment position appears to be reasonable based upon that net patient revenue per equivalent discharge metric. Also, we learned that current payment position shows that payment appears to be reasonable based on a sampling of the highest charge inpatient outpatient procedure codes relative to that regional average. So kind of the long and short of it is found in that last bullet point. Payment is at or below peers. Charges are at or above peers. Their payer mix appears to be more favorable. And what we think that this might indicate is some opportunity in your contract terms and rates for Maverick Hospital. And you may find the same as you do your own defensibility analysis. Okay, and with that, that concludes session 3. We're going to take a brief 15-minute break, and we'll be back for the next session. How can hospitals prepare for the future?